Thanks, Adrian, and it's really good to be able to get out of the office and join you here at the conference today. I think the program that you've got today and tomorrow looks very broad and ambitious in a way that I think housing and homelessness challenges in front of us are also broad and ambitious. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and to pay my respects to elders past and present. And probably also use this experience to talk a little bit about the journey that we've been on and how things have certainly accelerated for certainly a long-time public servant like myself over the last about 18 months now in terms of a sort of a policy development environment. It's clear that in Queensland since March we've had a policy environment that's sort of trying to keep pace with the government, that's sort of driving an ambitious and rapid reform agenda. And it's not just limited to sort of housing and homelessness, things that the Minister talked about before, but right across government, and sort of even trying to sort of keep pace with what's going on inside the Department of Housing and Public Works, where I'm from, is certainly a challenge for all of us. I'll just start by also sort of running back past some of the key issues that the Minister pointed out earlier this morning. He referred to a government's vision for a housing and homeless system which will be a good match between the housing needs and the available housing assets and services. But there'll be a significantly expanded role for the not-for-profit sector in doing that. But financial viability, innovation and partnerships will be a key feature of what we're looking for, and that the system will be use its existing financial and human capital resources to drive future growth. And at the scale that is being proposed by government, that there also need to be a significant investment in capacity building over the next 8 to 10 years as we go down this ambitious path. It's also useful, I think, to look at the decade of change that we've gone through. So we've got quite a list there of things that have been achieved within the Queensland context over the last 10 years. Starting from the Housing Act changes in 2003, which introduced a registration scheme for community housing, amongst other things, and brought community housing back into a closer relationship with government. It's probably worth noting that 8 years ago, prior to the introduction of the one social housing system, 92% of social housing properties were managed by the government and only 8% by the community sector. So it reinforces the points that Lucy made earlier about the rapid growth that we've seen in the community housing sector over the last 8 years, and the expectations going forward are going to, I guess, treble that. So we've also been through a journey around developing community housing standards, around growth in transitional housing arrangements, establishment of Brisbane Housing Company, and growth in change and structure and nature of non-government housing organisations. We've seen the National Rental Affordability Scheme come in and be taken up by a number of community housing providers, and Queensland continues to embrace that and has made a commitment to round 5 and is looking for an ongoing roll out of the NRAS scheme into the future. We've had the nation building scheme, which also has delivered significantly into the community housing sector in Queensland, about 4,000 dwellings. And we've also got the national partnerships that have occurred to provide capital over the last 3 or 4 years, of which the Remote Indigenous National Partnership and the Homelessness National Partnership still continue. We've had a registration system which has been a one-size-fits-all sort of a system. You know, you're in or you're out, and you're treated the same way whether you're running one property or 1,000. And as we know, that's about to change as well, but it certainly was the first steps towards a registration system. So in terms of the drivers for change, we've got there the Commonwealth Reform Agenda, but in fact it's a shared reform agenda between Commonwealth and state ministers. And in 2009, housing ministers committed to reforms to improve the viability and sustainability of the community housing system, including establishing the national system of regulation and setting a target of 35% into management by 2014. We've had within Queensland, a couple of years ago, the project that Adrian mentioned earlier, we've been working on a Future of Housing Assistance project for about 3 or 4 years in Queensland, which has started looking at the challenges for both government and community sector, particularly in the financial sense, as we sort of look at and explore the benefits of management transfer and title transfer, stock transfer, and probably fair to say that in the early stages of that, the mission was about getting government interested in across the line, and in more recent times, it's been how fast, how hard, and it's taken a life of its own, I guess. But all of that was built into the issues that governments have had in increasing times about the inability of the public housing system to sort of keep up with the pressures and the costs that are associated with it. So in Queensland, we were forecasting deficits of I think 140, 150 million for running the public housing system as it was. Government resources are fairly stretched in terms of revenues and the ability to pump money into it. I guess the rental receipts and other things such as the National Affordable Housing Agreement just don't keep up with the cost of running the services. More recently, we've had the introduction of the Housing and Other Legislation Amendment Bill, which has now turned into an Act, and that introduces the National Regulatory Scheme in Queensland. It will start on the 1st of January. We have a registrar who will be talking to you, I think, later on in the conference, Mark Francis, and increasingly his role is going to be pulled away from the housing services. He already has a direct line of reporting to the Director General of the Department and a direct relationship with the other registrars around Australia in bringing that scheme to fruition. And in Housing and Public Works, we have also been exposed to the Commission of Audit with a very detailed analysis of housing services that appeared in the recent Commission of Audit report, and also early exposure to the Public Sector Renewal Board, both of which have been very strongly promoting the sorts of reforms that the Minister talked about earlier. So the Commission of Audit report had one recommendation in relation to housing, which was to recommend a progressive transfer of social housing stock to the community sector. And the government response to that was that it committed itself to delivering new ways of providing public housing stock, including through different service models, including management by the community housing organisations and private partnerships. And I have to say, I suppose that as much as we talk about the advantages in the housing space, it's also, I guess, a philosophical approach that government is taking right across the board, as other speakers have alluded to earlier, and that we're part of, I guess, a broader shift within government about how things are changing and changing quickly. So the Minister mentioned the 4 priorities around housing. So just to recap there about renewing and reconfiguring social housing. So how do we redevelop and improve the ageing stock fleet that we have? Growing and innovating through partnerships, which is about the growth in the not-for-profit sector and the transfer of management. Facilitating pathways into the private market and better use of housing and support services. And from the face of it, I guess these are things that are probably fairly generic to most housing strategies that are evident around Australia. The Minister also pointed to the fact that he's now become the Minister for Homelessness. So from the 1st of July, those arrangements will move across into the Department of Housing and Public Works, and they will be accompanied by a homelessness strategy, which is placing a lot closer relationship with accommodation, bricks and mortar solutions as he described them, and better integration with the housing reforms and the housing capital arrangements that are going forward. So in terms of, I guess, the priorities over the next 12 months, it'll be to bed down the National Regulatory Scheme here in Queensland, and also to progress the Logan Renewal Initiative to the final stages of the procurement process. As the Minister mentioned, July or August we'd expect to have an announcement there. The Minister's plans will also be very heavily driven through regional housing plans right across Queensland, and that they'll be expected to be produced sometime within the next 12 months across all regions. That'll be characterised by major renewal projects. Probably 5 or 6 of them I think will be named in the strategy when it comes out, and looking at ways of expanding and assisting people into the private rental market. So, for example, he's working with the Defence Housing Authority about land exchanges and then building properties for us in exchange for the land, different sorts of ways of generating supply. So I guess just moving on, the Are You Ready context for what we're talking about. And I might just start reflecting on government because, while it's a big, ambitious reform that's in front of the community housing sector, it also requires a big shift for the relationship and the work that government does to make that work. We'll be shifting in role from, I guess, a prescriptive policy maker into the enabler sort of a role that the Minister referred to, an informed purchaser, investor, service partner, regulator. And to reflect, I suppose, one of the reasons that housing's been brought in the public works arena is that the public works side of the business is also going through that sort of a change as well, with Q-Build and projects moving away from direct service delivery more into contracting. So the synergies, I suppose, in that sort of arrangement are sort of consistent across the department. We will need to have, I guess, develop different sorts of relationships with the sector as we walk the walk. Our internal structures are going to have to change from, I guess, what's characterised as a sort of a command and control sort of arrangements through the public housing system into something that has a different sort of arrangement under contractual administration, but also around how we work with providers to continue to deliver services. We also need to think about it in the context of having the independent regulator in place. So one approach by housing programs now where we cover everything from compliance right through to policy making and performance sort of issues will need to be separated out, and we need to sort of make space for the regulator to do his work, as well as to think about what our role is as a funder and make sure that we're not duplicating the respective efforts and respective needs of the institutions that will arise. We'll also need to, as I mentioned earlier, invest more in capacity building. We have a capacity building function within our service delivery unit, but that's, again, I think, something that we're going to think through at a whole range of levels, from what we need to do with the large-scale stock transfers, but also in the smaller regional and remote settings, and making space for niche providers, because I think while the Minister's pointed to 8 to 10 key providers, there need to be a number of arrangements that allow diversity, allow smaller providers and providers who specialise in particular types of service to continue their operations. We also need to think about what the role of our housing service centres is going to be as we step out from the direct service role. I think that there still will need to be some sort of a regional presence from government to help with the rollout, and also to sort of recognise the change in environment if I can reflect on, I suppose, the nature of change that we're about to embark on, I think that there's definitely sort of a two-stage approach that we need to think about. Firstly, sort of a transitional arrangement over the first 3-5 years maybe, where we will need to work together about uncoupling what public housing does and sort of bringing community housing along with the current policy settings, but then at some point being able to step back and allow the community housing organisations to manage and to innovate and to do the things that they do best, without try and find that balance between what are the things that we would require of them and what are the things that we would encourage them to do without sort of a heavy hand of regulation or policy. In terms of the not-for-profit sector, I think the challenges, immediate challenges that are in front are thinking about with the looming national regulatory scheme. Where do you fit in that sort of arrangement? Do you still want to continue, and so on what basis? I don't think it was ever intended or ever expected that every organisation will want to be a large-scale developer, which is sort of where the Tier 1 registrations sit within the scheme, but that there'd need to be a mosaic of roles across the tiers, and it's, I guess, really up to the providers to sort of start thinking about where they think they're going to fit in the arrangements that are coming forward, and we're expecting over the next few months to start sort of coming out and talking directly with providers about what their future intentions are. Also, to think about arrangements amongst yourselves. I mean, I guess some talk about amalgamations, but there's all sorts of different ways that organisations can work together without necessarily having to sort of think about the amalgamation word. Other sorts of partnerships that can exist for particular purposes. We need to think about the service models and specialisation, and having homelessness come across has probably provided an opportunity to think more fully about how housing and support services fit together, and different sorts of models that could apply into the future. In Queensland, we're also unique that local government continues to be will continue to be a registered provider under the new scheme and the arrangements that we've made to the Housing Act in Queensland. But again, for them, it will be a journey about whether they continue as providers or look for other opportunities. And in terms of Indigenous housing, particularly in remote communities, there's a particular set of complexities that we need to deal with. For the remote community councils, the complexities sit within the application of the National Partnership Agreement on Remote Indigenous Housing. So under the housing that's under the 40-year lease arrangements there, it's arguably a public housing model and therefore falls outside the national regulatory scheme for the dwellings that those councils continue to manage themselves. Then arguably that falls inside the national regulatory scheme. So it's going to be sort of a fairly complex issue to unravel, both under the terms of the NAPARA but also the long-term future for Indigenous councils. Equally, we have the Indigenous community housing organisations around Queensland, 40 or 50 of which were never caught, I guess, under the Housing Act, but have an opportunity now to consider their position under the national regulatory scheme under a different sort of arrangement. But again, it'll depend, I guess, on what the historical funding arrangements are about how they choose to enter those arrangements. And we have a range of other stakeholders. So got state government agencies there, not forgetting, of course, the Commonwealth Government, who will have an interest in how things unfold here. The National Affordable Housing Agreement is due to be reviewed, I think, by June next year, and it'll be interesting to see whether the sort of questions was raised earlier about the relationship between CRA and the NAHA come to pass in any form. And also we have the National Partnership Agreement on Homelessness, which has just been renewed for another 12 months, but what happens after that is still in the lap of ministers, Commonwealth and State. We're expecting that the state policy will also encourage or find methods for other parts of government to become more involved in the housing space, and particularly in the economic development area, where we know that the Economic Development Queensland have particular powers in terms of housing affordability. The Government Land and Asset Management Group also have a role in land supply issues that we're going to pursue more vigorously under the plan. And we also need to think about how we can help our clients be ready, and the pace of change at the moment is it's probably an area that needs a lot of attention, I think, over the next 6 months, that they will need to be seamless, easy and positive for clients. I think that we will need to continue to reinforce that the one social housing system will continue to apply, that the registration systems that have been so successful and such a feature of how housing services are delivered in Queensland will continue to operate, and that we could expect that while the housing register numbers are probably at the lowest I've seen for quite some time, that they will swing up in the coming couple of years as the economic conditions continue to tighten, and that'll be a challenge, I think, for all of us to deal with as well. So just to wrap up, I think we've got a solid foundation to build on. Our future directions are challenging. The Minister and the Government have laid us all down a big challenge to change. We can only do it if we work together in this, and that we each recognise that we've got a journey and a big challenge in front of us if we're going to accept the challenge that's in front of us. And the last point I'd like to make is that while the plan comes out and give us a sort of a framework and a broad direction where government is heading, I think there's a lot of rich ground that collectively we need to work on to sort of fill out the spaces and make sure that the resources, the supports and the policies are in place to make this happen and make this a positive experience for everyone who's involved in the journey.